Okay, so maybe I'll start. So one of the interesting things you find when in the intersection of the gaming world and academia and research is there are really different timelines that people operate on, and in particular, PlayStation makes AAA games, and the timeline for making them are multiple years, 5 years sometimes, whereas the timelines for research developments, especially in AI, as you all know, are really fast. So Ryan Valenza, who is with the PlayStation Studios, Data and AI Central Technologies, is the person who basically does the research in connection with the studios, and the studios are often racing to get games out the door, and often don't have time for implementing the latest technology. So he has a really hard job. Anyway, he's going to tell you about himself, so I won't tell you that he's anything other than the fact that he's also a physicist, which I am too. So any physics majors, by all means, go into games and AI. All right, anyway, so enough blabbing.
Awesome.
Ryan.
Thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. And first off, thank you for attending my talk today, and thank you to our organizers for inviting me to give it. As Michael mentioned, I'm Ryan Valenza. I'm a senior director at PlayStation Studios. I lead our AI and data engineering teams. My group gets to work directly with our first-party game studios, where we are a central resource for machine learning and data engineering expertise. And prior to this role at PlayStation, I was the director of machine learning at Bungie, which is the studio behind Halo and Destiny, as well as Marathon. So my goal for this presentation today is that you walk away with some practical examples of how machine learning and AI has been applied within the games industry. And to do that, I plan to go over a few projects that my group has gotten to work on. These are fairly diverse in scope, so be prepared to context switch. I also want to spend some time going over really giving you my honest take on how the industry has reacted to AI, particularly generative AI. But first, let me give you some insight into who I am. So in life, I've been lucky enough to work in a variety of industries. Academically, I'm a mathematician and a physicist. I've gotten to work in aerospace at NASA, specifically Johnson Space Center. I was on the optical physiology team at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. You can see in the photo there that I've put in my time and worn my white lab coat and my hairnet. That's in a vacuum chamber at Stanford's Linear Accelerator. And I was also an early employee at a number of startups, most recently an e-commerce startup called Stackline. But the common thread throughout all my experience is a desire to solve challenging problems using data and machine learning, and of course, a love of games, which is why I made the switch to the games industry around 2019. All right, so this is the bulk of my professional experience, but let me talk about my credentials, the credentials that really matter, my gaming credentials. So games have been a huge part of my life as long as I can remember. And here you can see, my PlayStation stats, 1,700 trophies seems like a pretty big number, but truth be told, and don't tell my employer, I mostly play on PC, on Steam, which you can see here. My favorite game, and not up for debate, the best game of all time, is Bloodborne. But of course, anything From Software creates, I will play for dozens and dozens of hours. I also have 2,000 hours in Destiny 2. Of course, I worked there, but it's one of the reasons I chose to work there. It's because I love that game. Similarly, I have a max level character in most major MMOs, hundreds of hours in Guild Wars 2, ESO, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, which is my personal favorite. I think I play probably too many games in all genres. And I do that because I think games are an important part of how humans express themselves creatively. They're a key ingredient in keeping friendships together, especially over long distances. To me, they're one of the highest forms of art. And they're just good fun and a nice distraction in our chaotic world. But why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because I'm going to be talking about AI today. And I believe it's important that when we operate on the side of a potentially transformative technology, that we come from a place of understanding for the space that is being transformed. And in creative spaces like games, we listen to the creatives that are telling us how they wish to leverage the technology. And by playing games and working in games, I get a bit closer to that creative vision. It would also be disingenuous of me to come here and talk about AI in games as if everything's been easy. It has been a quite contentious time. The reaction from players has sometimes been mixed. That's why my first section is titled Internet Drama. We all love good internet drama, and with how passionate gamers can be, we have quite a lot of it. I'm going to be referencing this article, which I thought was a nice year-end summary for the game industry's 2025 experiments with AI. And in this article, you'll find conflicting opinions and quotes from game studios and publishers at every turn, which really shows how complex the AI rollout has been in games. I'm going to go over some of these and give you, some examples of how noisy this has been. For instance, this top headline is from the Nexon CEO. This is the group behind Arc Raiders, stating that it's important to assume that every game company is using AI. Arc Raiders got flack recently for launching their game with some synthetic voices in their NPCs. And though here their CEO is probably right, it's likely a decent assumption that most game studios are leveraging AI in some capacity, but it's not specific, right? Does asking ChatGPT to write you an email or summarize a news article count as using AI? And at the same time, Hooded Horse, which is the Manor Lord's publisher, stated that they will refuse to work with any studio that is leveraging generative AI. And their CEO has described the technology as cancerous. It's the same problem. Is this a global statement? Meaning if I use Midjourney to generate an image for this presentation, will they refuse to work with me? We're not really being specific in how we're reporting on AI in games. We're just kind of riling people up. Now here's a more measured take by the Witcher 4 devs, CD Projekt Red, one of my favorite studios. They say that AI has meaningful benefits, but it can't make games. That seems like a completely reasonable take. At the same time, you have Elon Musk stating that his XAI game studio will release a great AI-generated video game before the end of 2026. Right? He's got 11 months left. So on one hand, we have a very experienced developer stating that AI has benefits, but can't make games. On the other hand, you have a newcomer but arguably intelligent person stating that AI can generate full games. So what do you believe? The public reception to studios using AI and the studio response to that reception has also been pretty interesting to follow. In one very recent example, Larian CEO, Larian is the studio behind Baldur's Gate 3, which won the Game of the Year award, I believe 3 years ago. They stated that they were using AI early on during the ideation stages of development, but not to replace concept art. And this was for the new game Divinity, which was just announced. That simple statement got so much backlash that less than a month later, they changed their mind. Just last week, they stated they're no longer going to allow the use of generative AI for concept art. So there can be no discussion about the origin of the art in their game. Similarly, Clair Obscur Expedition 33, which won the Game of the Year award this last December, was disqualified from the Indie Game Awards for claiming that they used AI early in development. However, despite this drama, there isn't really evidence yet that this is affecting game sales. So maybe it's just a vocal minority that's influencing these developers, but it is definitely affecting developer fear when it comes to AI. Last year was also the year that Epic released Darth Vader into Fortnite. They obtained permission to clone the voice of James Earl Jones and worked with, I believe, 11 Labs to create a dynamic NPC that players could find in-game and have conversations with. I've had a lot of conversations in the industry about this event. And depending on who you ask, it was either a great innovation that pushed the boundaries of AI in gaming, or it was a complete travesty that exacerbated an already contentious situation with SAG-AFTRA, who I believe at the time were on strike. SAG-AFTRA is the union behind most AAA voice acting and motion capture talent. And AI was a huge component of that strike, and they only settled it after getting protections against AI. And there are countless other examples of game studios and publishers experimenting with AI, just like every other company in the world is doing. And our audience, and in some cases our developers, our studios, react in a mixed way. At the same time, there is a lot of evidence, and we've seen this directly at PlayStation, that AI is a huge productivity boon. Epic CEO Tim Sweeney stated that it increases human productivity by integer multiples. That though can sometimes be interpreted as needing fewer employees, right? Which is causing some anxiety in the industry because we're contracting. And this goes on and on and on. I think you can tell that there's a lot of emotion, fear, and uncertainty in the industry right now when it comes to AI. But let me summarize what's going on. So one thing is clear, that AI natives generally underestimate the complexity of game development. If you ignore tech and the need to be performant on device and operate as really a large-scale simulation of our world, if you focus on the creative side alone, games encompass every other piece of entertainment, right? Games have music, and they have sound effects. They have human performances. They have both voice and motion capture. They have 2D and 3D art. They have videos in the forms of cutscenes. They have a narrative, and they have dialogue. They also have a need to be fun and interactive, which is often overlooked, but is arguably the hardest part in games. Studios spend a lot of time iterating, trying to find the fun of the game they're developing, and sometimes they don't find it until their last 3 months of development. Another thing that's going on is that there's a decent amount of fear and uncertainty on the development side due to the assumed loss of creative control, right? The human touch in games. Even something that seems like a logical application, like our last talk, like AI NPCs. I've had developers say that they want to retain complete creative control over every line of dialogue that a player experiences, and are usually unwilling to pass that off to a fully stochastic system. And also, I think it's clear from these headlines that we're losing nuance in what AI even is, right? I guarantee you most gamers don't know the difference between generative AI and reinforcement learning or traditional ML. And that bothers me because, as I assume everyone here knows, machine learning has a very rich history. It's been part of games for decades in various forms. Statistics is the backbone of our analytics. Computer vision is used all over in anti-cheat technology. And of course, reinforcement learning evolved with and for games, at least initially. It's only recently with the advent of generative AI, specifically generative AI applied to creative domains, that we're seeing this large reaction. And nothing illustrates this more than my own appearance. I'll explain. I joined the games industry before generative AI was a thing. I was at Bungie before ChatGPT rolled out, before anyone in the industry was using a diffusion model in any serious way. And I found a photo from my first day walking into the offices of Bungie HQ. And I want you to compare that photo with a more recent one. All right, so here's a photo of me on my first day at Bungie. And you can see how youthful and happy I look. I'm just so excited to join the games industry and solve some really challenging problems using math and science. I was training models on data sets that we ourselves owned in studio, and I didn't have to talk to anyone outside of analytics. It was pretty nice. And of course, this is me now. Now everyone wants to know what I'm up to. What am I doing with these scary AI models? And I don't really get to train models anymore. It's more about leveraging models that other people train on external data, which means I have to care about copyright law, and I never, ever, ever wanted to care about copyright law in my life. All right, so let's talk about studios, given all this drama, would even entertain the idea of generative AI. Well, the reality is that we're facing numerous industry challenges. Over the past decade, AAA budgets have more than tripled. This is mostly due to a desire of studios to one-up themselves. We're doing this to ourselves in a lot of cases. Games, as time, have also gone on to, they've also gotten more complex, and they've gotten larger in scope. This requires larger teams and longer dev cycles. Also with time, because we're one-upping ourselves, player expectations have been ever increasing. Players want more content and frequent updates with fewer bugs, better performance, and 24/7 live service support, all without a price hike. And it's true that post-COVID, people are spending less on games, but mostly, again, we did this to ourselves. For instance, if you look at any PlayStation title and compare it to its sequel, you'll find that the sequel is essentially twice the original. You'll find that maps have doubled, map sizes have doubled. We add more characters, more enemy types, more weapons, more racetracks. And that means an increasing number of engineers to deal with that added complexity, more artists to create the content, more QA staff to test the content. And most of our costs in games scale linearly with this complexity. And again, this is without a large price hike, right? The price increased by about $10, PS4 to PS5, But when you've doubled the size of your game, that $10 is just incremental. We're effectively devaluing our content as time goes on. And no other industry would do this, right? If McDonald's is not going to double the size of a Big Mac and then charge you a cent more. They're going to double the price. But in games, we really can't do that because we're already pretty expensive relative to the spending potential of our consumer base. Games are already at risk of becoming a bit boutique. So what can we do, right? We have increasing player expectations and rising costs. Well, one thing that we can do is we can reduce our ambition. We can release fewer, less innovative titles, smaller titles. That would mean we require fewer people. And if you've been paying attention, many studios have gone this route, right? We've had numerous layoffs in our industry and really throughout tech. And SIE has not been immune to this. Of course, this is not what we want to do, right? We want to release bigger, more innovative titles and really meet players where they want to be. Or at least we want to keep the status quo. So what else can we do? Well, we need to find ways for our teams to scale their output without further increasing their costs. Right? We need to innovate outside of headcount growth or crunch. And this is, of course, where AI and automation come into play. This is why the games industry is flirting with AI today, by and large. It is primarily to flatten this linear cost curve. All right, so that was all preamble. Next, I want to discuss via several project case studies how game studios are leveraging AI, both traditional machine learning as well as generative AI. And this next section is heavily biased towards my own experience leading ML teams in games, specifically at Bungie and now PlayStation. So while I was at Bungie, and really still today, we organized our ML team across 4 primary project categories or focus areas: analytics, game content, game operations, and security. Analytics was primarily a publishing function for us. It had the goal of using telemetry from Destiny 2 and other games to better understand the needs of our players and the health of our game so that we can better inform design. For operations, we really mean machine learning to assist with all the systems that were necessary to support a live service game. And security, I won't be talking about in much detail today. They get really nervous when I talk about security. I think they bugged my phone. But we have, of course, had a number of cheaters and toxic participants in all of our games. So we use machine learning heavily to combat them. And finally, we do employ machine learning to help our creative teams to develop content more efficiently. So now I'm going to go through several projects one by one. Feel free to ask questions. So, is that playing? Yeah, cool. So the first project I want to talk about it was kind of a surprise to me because I have a background in science. I didn't really know much about game development. And when I learned about this project, it made me realize just how complex games can truly be because everything has to be developed. Everything has to be created. So when you're playing a game, and a simple thing like walking with your character, when you hear a footstep sound every time your foot hits the ground, something has to tell the game engine that a sound should be played when your foot hits the ground. That is done manually. And there are so many cases of this where, depending on the frame of animation in a game, you want to trigger some VFX, a gameplay event, or a sound tag. Again, usually an entirely manual process, or at least sometimes heuristically done. We have an ML model that can do this for most of our games. And I'll play this one more time. Here you can see a skeleton animation of someone throwing a baseball. The spikes that you can see are the sound or the gameplay event tags that usually designers will add. And the green circles are our model's predictions. So we're able to predict those key frames of importance. All right, so that was traditional ML. I now want to switch over to generative AI. And before I do that, I want to, as a preface to this discussion, I want to decompose the disciplines within a game studio, right? Just to these 3. We have production and publishing, which is responsible for aligning the creative vision to our roadmap, handling the budget, measuring game health, and balancing the creative ambition with the commercial reality of today, right? Is there a market for our game? We We have tech and engineering, responsible for engine, gameplay systems, tools, online services, etc. My group is in tech and engineering. And then we have art and design, which is responsible for the creative vision of the game. What does it look like? How does it feel? And what makes it fun? Now, I don't think it's particularly surprising, but much of our communication around AI in games is focused on the art and design side, which to me is unfortunate. Right? While there is a lot of potential for AI to augment creatives, there's a lot of unseen opportunities in technology and the production spaces. And in tech in particular, mid last year seemed to be the point in time where game industry engineers really discovered the value and started actively using AI coding agents in their day-to-day. And I predicted that this is the year where we'll start to realize that value. However, again, this is a space where you can find pretty much every opinion around the usefulness of Gen AI for code. Here are two very prominent software engineers. On the left, Karpathy states that he's never felt more behind as a programmer, right? And that he could be 10 times more productive due to the tools that are coming out. On the other hand, you have Jonathan Blow. Jonathan Blow is a very talented game developer. He's the developer behind Braid and The Witness. And he states that the output quality of AI code is very low and that it can't generate complex programs. So the thing is, and the thing to realize about generative AI in games, both of these opinions are simultaneously true, right? Jonathan Blow works in a domain of high complexity where there's generally not a lot of representation of his space in the training data that went into these models. He's also someone that, for his most recent game, he developed not only his own engine, but an entirely new programming language, right? So he's an intense guy. But not everything we do in games is high complexity or even permanent, right? We develop online services. We develop websites. We have build and debug tools. And we have analytics, right? And the value we're seeing heavily depends on what domain you're a part of. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say on software engineering. It's not that interesting to talk about autocomplete, but feel free to ask me about it if you like. I want to move on to one of my favorite projects that we have to work on. This is a project to leverage generative AI to improve the player feedback cycle in games, especially our live service games. And if it wasn't clear from my section on internet drama, studios and publishers, they obviously care about the opinions of their player base. It's the voice of their customer, right? And these voices can shape development decisions. So what we try to do here is we try to get access to those channels of player conversation, and we leverage AI to effectively run robust topic modeling and sentiment analysis that we then form as reports and send off to our development teams. Those development teams then push out an update, and the cycle continues, right? People talk about the update, we analyze that feedback, and it goes on and on and on. Another area, hopping to second topic, another area where we're leveraging AI is in player support, right? Studios generally have a support channel where players can submit a ticket describing some issue that they're having with the game or studio. Sometimes they're reporting a bug. Other times they're angry and they're using it as an avenue for harassment. This happens a lot. Also, player support teams are generally fairly small and they can get easily buried in a large backlog of player requests. So a little bit of help goes a long way here. And in this example, we're not leveraging AI to interact or respond to players. What we're doing is, as tickets come in from players, we're augmenting that data. We are translating it into the operator's language of choice, be it English or wherever they're located, wherever they speak. We're, similar to topic modeling, we're supplying a category to the ticket. Is it harassment? Is it a mission glitch or a bug, which they can then use to filter or prioritize. And then we're also measuring sentiment, but for player support, that's not useful. It's usually low. Because if you're at the point where you're submitting a ticket, you're not saying like, I love your game, this is the best thing ever. You're just saying, here's a bug I found, or harassing me. Right. So we're enriching the support data as it comes in to better help our teams. But also this data, and this is on one ticket, this data in aggregate has a lot of value, right? You can, for instance, look at players that have reported bugs. So we can have AI analyze the tens of thousands of tickets that come in near real time and look for bugs and find commonalities across those bug reports. And here's an example of that for Helldivers 2, where we are specifically looking for stratagem bugs. Stratagems are items you use via QuickTime events. Obviously, this is a report, but we could just as easily file this as a bug report with our dev teams and whatever tool they choose, Jira, is what we're doing today, usually Jira. A very similar problem is in launch readiness. As a game is developed, not only is it being play tested externally, it's also, of course, being play tested internally by our QA teams. And those teams file a lot of bugs for our studios. Some of those bugs are really high in priority, where we absolutely cannot ship with it live. And others are small graphical bugs that will go unnoticed. We're now leveraging LLMs to ingest this large amount of QA data to generate these reports to help our teams determine whether we're ready for launch. All right, so the only example from art that I'm going to show and discuss is a project on hair strand generation. And something I learned due to this project is that character artists, by and large, find hair modeling to be a fairly grueling task. So alongside our character technology team, we're investigating a new way to develop in-game hairstyles. This is a series of generative models that can take in a panoramic video of someone's hairstyle, segment it frame by frame, and extract the hair. And then via AI, it's able to synthetically grow that hair according to the shape gleaned from the video. And from this, you can imagine that rather than digitally crafting hairstyles, we can be more analog. We can have professional hairstylists come in and develop styles for us on mannequins that we can then scan and use in a game. And this is just an example of how AI is changing a domain in a positive way, creating new opportunities that we didn't have access to before. All right, so I'm going to leave you with several takeaways in my conclusion. So in general, with machine learning and generative AI in games, we've had the most success in areas where we have an abundance of data available, right? For report generation, topic modeling, simple automation, just like standard machine learning, right? Data is where the power is in the end. For automation tasks, we prioritize solving problems of scale, right? Areas where we could never have enough humans to solve the problem. This is not only a cultural thing in a studio, but it's also just generally where we see the most value, right? You're never going to have a research team that can analyze 50,000 conversations or 50,000 surveys. You need some automation to do that. We also target problems of decently high complexity, right? Like topic modeling isn't the simplest thing. Hair strand generation isn't the simplest thing. If you can write the rules down in an algorithm to do something, it's usually better to do that than apply machine learning. On the art side, we've mostly, there have been some articles, but we've mostly avoided pushback or bad PR by listening to our creatives and how they want to leverage this technology, right? No one is forced at PlayStation to use Gen AI. It's an option to them. And my group our goal is to provide the tooling and the guidance and use of the tooling. We're not forcing anyone to leverage it. That being said, we're seeing a lot of value in those that choose to leverage it. And also, one thing I wanted to end with is, despite the contentious nature of AI in games, the games industry is incredibly diverse and is vast enough for all opinions to be simultaneously true, right? If you look at the games that have come out over the last decade, or even just last year, my most played game last year was developed by a single 21-year-old, Lethal Company. At the same time, you have equally popular games developed by teams of 200 plus in the AAA space. My points are largely biased towards AAA Western game development, but there's room for AI games to exist alongside that, right? Like we might have a fully AI-generated game alongside Last of Us 2, right? One does not need to replace the other, right? They can exist in parallel. And that's one of the reasons why I love games. All right, thank you all. That was my talk. Any questions?
Thank you for the lecture. So I'm curious from the tooling perspective. I think a lot of the, whether it's traditional ML or the newer Gen AI tools, they seem to be pretty there's a steep curve for like smaller studios or indie game developers to build their own. I wonder in the industry, are people mostly like outsourcing those kind of like operations things or lifecycle management tools to like other companies, or is there like a newer trend with AI and like vibe coding? People are starting to make their own tools. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, if you look at the industry, one thing that's happening is becoming an independent developer today is very challenging. Most major studios in the AA and AAA space are tied to a publisher, or in our case, a platform. And the platform and publisher usually where your financial security comes in, and also where your central tooling exists. So in a lot of those cases, it's a central group that is providing the tooling for studios. It might be that now with vibe coding, you can whip up an AI tool very quickly in the indie and AA space, but at least in my area, it's the publisher or the platform doing that.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. A lot of the AI you talked about here are like kind of using it to make the game. Is there any company that you work with or talk to that uses AI like extensively for the like gaming part of the game, like actually playing the game, besides something like the NPC kind of dialogue, more interesting situation?
Are you referring to like gameplay automation, like through reinforcement learning or imitation learning?
Or yeah, just anything that use the AI in a more, I don't know, extensive way for the gaming experience.
So we do have several internal efforts around like imitation learning and reinforcement learning. Sony AI is a division of our company that came up with GT Sophie, which is the reinforcement learning agent that can play Gran Turismo professionally. And that is actually a feature in that game where now you can play against an AI. And some of the world's best racers can't beat it.
Thank you.
For us, though, that type of thing is usually to help with QA.
Thank you for the lecture. Just circling back to the topic around these internal tools you've been building, like these things across QA, sentiment analysis, etc. Like they're obviously they look like they've been vibe coded and maybe they've been like built to solve a like particular challenge you're facing with your team, which seems to be like a central team that does this. And like you just said, the central like the publisher of the platform might be developing tooling that other studios could use. But I'm kind of just curious about like the state of those initiatives. Like, have you been kind of doing these point solutions for Marathon, for example, for a specific game where like the like customer support was kind of getting intractable, and like what does it take to evolve these tools into like actual infrastructure that will now be used by Sony and like rolled out more broadly? So I guess I'm mostly just curious, like, have you done a few validating cases and are now thinking, how do we turn this into actual like tissue for the company? Or has it been like maybe top-down imperative from or directive from like Sony to actually have your like data and ops team build out like next-gen infrastructure for the studios?
Yeah, so I would say Sony is pretty averse to top-down, so it's mostly organic. But our strategy here is to, as you said, have a number of clear wins. And vibe coding is really useful for that, where in the end, my team is creating a data product. We're creating for every message, we want a topic assigned to that message with sentiment. And then you can aggregate that and form analytics and format those analytics as a report. Vibe coding is really useful for that. And that helps us with getting studio buy-in, because studios need to see that this is real. Right? They're new to AI, and showing them an example from their game really helps. So for my team, we're at the stage where we're not vibe coding those reports. Like, that's not our production system. That's just useful for show. We're creating a data product. And then studios can, through our analytics platform, pull in that data into all of our usual analytics tools like Tableau and Looker and Omni, et cetera.
Maybe just one follow-up on that. In like looking for those quick wins, I'm just curious like how you have determined like what is a like maybe an environment where the pain's high, where maybe feedback will come in quite fast on whether this tool was useful. How did you go about that?
Yeah, so we look for areas where we have a lot of data, because we know that, I mean, one, we have a decent understanding of what LLMs are good at and what they're not good at. Like we spend a lot of time, my team, playing with these tools and contributing to these tools. So we look for areas where we can use an LLM where it shines, which is in at least summarization. And topic modeling and sentiment analysis is a form of summarization. So that's number one. We also look for disciplines in a studio that are more receptive to this type of tooling, right? Production, if you talk to a producer, they're usually swamped because they're the ones dealing with the budget and the scheduling of all these pesky game developers. So they're the ones most in need of help at times. And these types of reports really help them.
Thank you so much for being there. It's fascinating. So many use cases I had no idea about, which is amazing. The two questions I have around sort of the sentiment analysis and the summarization is, anyone who spent time on the forums knows, the most extreme opinions are often the ones that are most talked about. I'm curious how representative you're finding the overall sentiment, especially through the, self-selecting communities of Reddit and Discord and things versus like how closely those match the representative player action, and along the way through the summarization, if you've run into anything around not quite hallucination at that scale, but in cases, the edge cases in which generative AI fail. Right.
So I think the first question, I think analysts are split. So if you look at how analysis on social listening data is done today, some people believe that dominant opinion prevails, meaning if you're on X or you're on Reddit, the things that are getting upvoted the most are the opinions that matter. And that's because there's a view that most people don't talk at all, right? You're voting with, it's easier to click thumbs up than it is to type out a comment. So by clicking thumbs up, you're actually the voice of the majority. Other people disagree. Other people want to evenly sample throughout all conversations. I think for us, it's a hybrid approach. So this is solving a problem of scale for us where we're able to analyze more conversations than we ever have been able to before. But we don't do this currently, but we have toyed with the idea of weighting things based on upvotes, number of child comments, what have you. I would say we're still figuring it out, basically. And your second question around hallucinations, we don't see that as much anymore. Like early on, when ChatGPT first launched, we definitely saw that. There was some weird report where it just started talking about, I think, like solar flares. I don't know what it was about. It may have gotten confused by something a player said. But at least these days, we use LLMs kind of like a CPU, where it's doing a very specific task for us that's hard to mess up. We're not doing it as a one-shot where it's analyzing everything all at once and generating the report and doing sentiment. It's usually more nuanced than that.
Yeah. One question, very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, we talk about a couple of these AI intro tools. How your company could be make decision making with institution levels. Think about maybe one of them or some of them. They could be the company levels infrastructure.
Yeah.
So how make this decision? What kind of process?
Oh, you mean like organizationally?
Decision making process. For example, maybe one from maybe bottom up from one maybe a game, but then every studio think that's perfect. We could make it to the company levels infrastructure.
Do you mean in terms of like the games we greenlight or the projects in the ML team that we greenlight?
I think first one, yes.
First one? Yeah, so we have a, what is it called? It's called like a development review cycle where studios are free to have ideas and they can ideate and they can incubate certain titles early on. But then once you reach a certain milestone, there is generally, through the PSS leadership team, review and oversight of that idea. And that typically involves market analysis, like how well does that game fit into the market of today? And when you get to a certain point, you also start doing external play tests, right? Usually closed, signed NDA play tests. And so we can get that direct feedback to influence the game. This actually came as a result of Concord, right?
Hey, I really liked the first question from the gentleman in the front a couple ago. And I just wanted to follow up. You said, hey, when you're doing sentiment analysis, some communities think, well, the biggest, noisiest comments are what's important. Some people disagree. To me, that sounds almost metaphysical, but is there ground truth? Is there a signal that you're finding that helps actually corroborate? Like, oh, in this case, we can really tell which it was between those hypotheses.
Yeah, so the truth is that the signals are aligned more than you'd think. So usually the most popular opinions, the ones being upvoted, also represent what most of the people are talking about. And usually that does reflect what we see in a game. So one common thing is, Destiny players love sparrow racing. That was a mode in our game when it came out. That has come up in the dominant opinion, but also in the prevailing opinion, the ones that aren't getting upvoted. And it also shows up in our user research studies, and that's kind of what we use as like our true north, our truth. If you're asking about in-game, that is usually harder because so much of this is after the fact, meaning we did something, and then players respond to what we did, so then we adjust our development direction. And then in games, it's not like a perfect science where you can change one thing and analyze how that one thing affected the whole experiment. You're changing 20 things at once, and you're just hoping for the best. So a lot of the analysis is just taking these signals and trying to find directional correctness in the average.
So for a player sentiment, there like large upvote like regions can exist on different threads, but when you consider like a balance of something, like in Destiny, maybe there's like a really tiny community that really likes something that's kind of overpowered, but the rest of the community doesn't like it. But if you were to nerf this like overpowered thing, you'd lose that chunk of that community who is constantly engaging with your game, and maybe they engage more with the game than this like more outcry of the community. Like, how do you make sure that these things are balanced? I guess this was also a problem even before like LLM analysis was a thing, but like how has LLMs helped solve this as an issue? Or
I think LLMs, because we're able to process so much more information, allow us to discover those communities. But I don't think we've figured out how to change our dev cycle to really respond to that yet. Because the truth is, you don't cater to every community in a game, right? You balance the prevailing opinions with your vision for what the game should be. And if a game designer says, I really want to nerf this category of weapons, then that community, even though they exist and we have evidence that they exist, is going to be disappointed. And that's just one of the, I think, interesting things about game development is it's not, the game that caters to us all is dreadfully boring, right? There's probably another game for that community elsewhere. And we have enough diversity where we can find it.
Thank you.
Actually, now I have a question. So, apropos of what you're saying, there are games like Baldur's Gate, for example, is notoriously really, really difficult, and that not everybody wants to play it because it's really, really difficult. But my question is somewhat related to that. And nobody in the course so far has talked about this, but I mean, there are influencers out there, and there are game awards for best games. Do you study that and whether or not those people, those influencers, the people who have lots of followers, whether they drive sentiment at all? Maybe you said something about it and I missed it, but I'm just kind of curious if that's a thing.
Yes, I don't study it personally, but I'm tangential to teams that do. And the analysis of influencer communities and then fostering those relationships with influencers is an important part of gaming. Like it's something that we try to not control, but have them be a part of the development. They're typically invited to studios and given early bills, allowed to give feedback, and we take that into account.
Yes.
I'm just kind of interested more on the financial aspect. I know you mentioned, right? Obviously, the trend is that games are getting more expensive. Like, as a player, like the fact that Mario Kart's $90 and that GTA 6 will be like 120, it's kind of scary. So, like, is that just going to be the trend in general, or is there really efforts to try to actually reduce those prices? And can you talk about a little bit about the tactics involved in reducing
Yeah.
those prices?
So to be honest, I have no control over the price of a PlayStation game. I would love to be able to do whatever I want, but like what I know is that games have not really increased price very much in 30 plus years, right? And if you compare our product to every other product, there's been some inflationary adjustment to every other product, but not ours, right? Like games in the 90s were like $50, $60, and they're pretty much that today. That doesn't make sense, right? That's because of the market that we're in. And also, it's because compared to the 90s, there wasn't a lot of competition where you could charge $60 for a game because there weren't that many game developers, there weren't that many games. Now, we cannot increase price. I do not believe we can increase price too high because there are so many indies and AA games that are never going to increase price to that degree. And the tooling to get into game development, like the Unreal Engine and things like MetaHuman, make it more approachable than ever. So those indies and AA games are pretty high quality. Some of my favorite games are indie games. So I think we're trying to keep things flat.
Hello again. It sounds like, if I'm right, like with your team kind of works on like Sony-wide, is that correct, or is it?
So PlayStation Studios,
PlayStation
so
Studio,
the first-party game studios,
Okay.
Naughty Dog, Insomniac.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much analysis happens between game, like is there, is PlayStation interested in this type of analysis across all of their games in a way that would affect resourcing of what kinds of games get developed for the future? Is it this kind of cycle of like, oh, everybody loved Destiny, so we're gonna pour all our resources into doing it, rather than, I don't know the right way to ask this question, but I think what I see so much around AAA gaming is this cycle, especially in live service things, of like, oh, a lot of this analysis is happening after the fact, and so it's about how we can maximize things within this existing system, and less about so much of what the indies are doing of inventing entirely new ways to play games or to interact, and like that's where all of the joy is found. So my question is does PlayStation use your data analysis across all of their games to affect resourcing for future game development?
So how do I say? So it's an interesting area because it points to an area of contention we have just at every major publisher and platform, which is that the game studios, they're a part of the same ecosystem, PlayStation, but they're necessarily competing for market, right? Especially in live service, where you can't, unless you're insane like me, you cannot play 5 MMOs simultaneously, right? You have to pick. So they're competitors. What we provide centrally is analysis for our leadership to make business decisions at that level. But a lot of PlayStation is not live service. Most of it is not. I think we have a handful, 4 or 5. We are mostly a shop for single-player, narratively driven, narrative experiences, right, of the highest quality. And those games don't really compete with one another. So they're not generally competing for resources. We also have a bit of, the tech does not exactly map studio to studio. So it's not like we can say, sorry, Naughty Dog, you're now all working on the next Spider-Man game, because different engines, different expertise.
Hello. I guess maybe somewhat related to that question is how like analyzing trends in the industry. So like with the length of a game development, seeing a trend of a type of multiplayer game being really popular, and like it's clear that it has really good margins. I don't know Fortnite if it has really good margins with how much money people spend in it, given its development cycle. Trying to get like a higher up could see that and say we want our own Fortnite, we want our own live service game that constantly generates revenue and can maybe help fund other interesting projects. How do you look at that and then analyze, okay, in 5 years or so, if we put out this, will people care? Will the market be interested in it? And are we different enough that would pull someone away from a game that they've invested 5 years of their own money into? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I think the industry, when it comes to live service all in all, is starting to realize that Fortnite was lightning in a bottle, and that's very hard to recreate, right? So I don't think that's the ambition. I think it starts at what does the game developer want to make? Like, what is their creative vision for what they want to put out in the world? And then everything comes after. Like, what is the market for that type of thing they want to create? And if there isn't one, then they don't get greenlit. And through like this iterative process of evaluating the market throughout development, we are ensuring that we're aligned over time with market. And now if things shift, then we'll either shift type of game using like what exists. If you're building an MMO, it turns out MMOs aren't really popular anymore, let's say, now you're making a battle royale, right? Using the same assets, the same engine, what have you. That hasn't happened, but that's probably what would happen.
Okay, well, so first of all, let's thank Ryan again